Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Professor Lee Rayford, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the third conversation in our 21-22 Critical Conversation series, Catching Up with June, celebrating the life and legacy of June Jordan. Today's event, as I mentioned, is the third in our year-long series, and it is entitled Black Girlhood, Truth, and Transformation. Before we get started, though we meet in a virtual space, we want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Department of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley recognizes that UC Berkeley, where our work takes place, sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We recognize that we are guests on this land and that the dispossession of Indigenous people is ongoing. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from and use the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. And as members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. You can support ongoing Ohlone efforts to save the West Berkeley Shell Mound and Village site here in Berkeley at the link that we'll drop in the bio. And we'd like to give credit and thanks to UC Berkeley Centers for Educational Justice and Community Engagement and the Native American Student Development Office for helping us craft this acknowledgement. Today's conversation, Black Girlhood, Truth, and Transformation, again, is the third installment of our year-long celebration of the life and legacy of writer, activist, and longtime UC Berkeley faculty member, June Jordan. You can find out more about the remainder of the series, which will take place in the spring, by going to our department website. And this series builds on our successful Spring 2021 series celebrating Dr. Barbara Christian and exploring the concept of abolition democracy. Our Critical Conversation series continues to ask, what are the lessons of the Black feminist, Black radical, and Black intellectual traditions for our moment? And what is the role of Black studies in building more just futures? The Critical Conversation series is supported by the Abolition Democracy Initiative, a 3-year department initiative that began in fall 2020 with the goal of centering and responding to the most pressing questions of our moment. Questions that were perhaps new to some, but that we understood as enduring questions about Black freedom and the ongoing project of abolition. With the support of the Office of the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, the Office of the Chancellor and Dean of Social Sciences, Rocco Ray, and inspired by the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis, and others writing in the abolitionist tradition, the Abolition Democracy Initiative amplifies the work of activists and academics. Activists and academics. Sometimes we get those confused, and sometimes they are one and the same. Who are actively imagining and building a world beyond policing and prisons. I want to acknowledge and thank the members of the ADI leadership team, Professors Nikki Jones, Eula Taylor, and Tiana Pichel, for their leadership and vision that created the Abolition Democracy Initiative. And I want to thank you as well to Rachel Ansbach and Maria Edadia for your invaluable administrative support. Our Critical Conversations series is co-sponsored by the Black Studies Collaboratory, which I am director. And you can see more information about that program also at the Black Studies Collaboratory website. You can find a full schedule for the remaining events of this year's Critical Conversation series on our department's website. You can also sign up for email lists for both the department community and the Black Studies Collaboratory. This spring is going to be really full and really rich, as has the fall been. Finally, today's Event is being recorded and posted along with other conversations in this series on the department's YouTube channel. A live transcript of this recording is also being generated. Before I turn it over to my really brilliant and wonderful, generous colleague, Professor Nikki Jones, who will be your moderator for today's panel, and will also introduce our distinguished guests, I just want to end with a few thank yous and a final logistical point. First, our deepest thanks to our panelists for today. We appreciate you taking the time to be here, to share your work and your ideas, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you to our colleagues at ETS, Educational Technology Services, for supporting the webinar for today's event. And a big thank you to all of those of you who are watching this conversation live or in a recording for joining the conversation. We really value the community that you make with us. After the conversation or during the conversation, please submit your questions through the question and answer feature. Don't use the chat window because we're going to reserve that for troubleshooting technical issues and shout outs and love to each other. So Q&A, use the Q&A function. And if you're having any AV trouble or would like assistance, please send us a message in the chat window and we'll try to offer you support. So let me turn to introducing our moderator for today's program, Professor Nikki Jones. Professor Jones is the H. Michael and Jeannie Williams Department Chair of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley. Her work examines the impact of violence, policing, and the criminal legal system on Black people in urban settings, especially Black youth. She's the author of 2 books, Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence, which was published in 2009, and The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption, which was published in 2018. This latter book received the Michael J. Hindelang Outstanding Book Award from the American Society of Criminology in 2020. Professor Jones is at work on a 3rd book project, currently titled Brutal and Routine: Why Police Reform Always Fails and Why We Need Police Abolition. You can read more about Professor Jones's work in the link to her bio posted in the chat. And you are in very good hands. I'm very excited for this really important and moving, what I know will be a powerful discussion. With that, I hand it over to you, Professor Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rayford, for that introduction and for your leadership, both with the Abolition Democracy Initiative and the Black Studies Collaboratory. Certainly the work of the ADI would not happen without you, and so we appreciate you. Thank you, good afternoon, and welcome to our panelists and to all of you who are joining us today. I'm very excited about today's panel, Black Girlhood, Truth and Transformation, and for the opportunity to be in conversation with Kat Brooks, Kenley Brown, and Holly Joshi on the enduring themes of Black girlhood that connect their work and experiences with June Jordan's writing on Black girlhood. I know it will be a rich and generative conversation that will help us to think more deeply about the many ways in which a Black girl child's truth can provide an abolitionist vision for transforming the world. As I shared with our panelists in preparation for today's conversation, I only came to June Jordan's writings on Black girlhood recently in the wake of the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the uprisings against systemic racism and police violence that marked the summer of 2020. And I share that because some of you, through these conversations, may be coming to Jordan's work for the first time, and that's okay. These conversations are an invitation. Expertise is not a prerequisite to join the conversation. Throughout that summer into the fall, I found solace in the works of writers like James Baldwin and Barbara Christian, who we honored in our Spring 2020 series, the poetry of Alice Walker, and the essays of June Jordan, along with the work of other writers, artists, activists, and abolitionists. I turned to Jordan's essay collection, Civil Wars, after reading an article in New Yorker magazine by Claire Schwartz on Jordan's abolitionist vision for rebuilding Harlem back in 1964, following uprisings sparked by the police killing of a Black teenager named James Powell. And Jordan's architectural imagination was the topic of our last critical conversation. There's so much in Civil Wars that speaks to the present moment, that is prescient, as we discussed in our first conversation of the year, that puts us into the position of catching up with June. And of all the writing in that collection, it is the foreword to the book, just over 3 pages of writing, that provides something of a roadmap and certainly an inspiration for our conversation today. The foreword begins with a reflection on Black girlhood, and the need to learn how to fight. In Jordan's case, this need first emerged in her childhood home, where she regularly confronted the physical and verbal blows of her father, who she describes in those pages as, quote, the first regular bully in my life. Her uncle, who she describes in her memoir, Soldier, as the first Black man in her life, lived close and with the understanding, as Jordan writes, that, quote, outside intervention has its limits, taught her how to fight. Just a few paragraphs in, Jordan shifts from the physical battles of Black girlhood to her love of words, the recognition of the world-making power of words, the transformation that comes from telling the truth. And here we see Jordan make a choice, quote, I loved words and I hated to fight. But if, as a Black girl child in America, I cannot evade the necessity to fight, then maybe I could choose my weaponry at least, end quote. And words did become her weaponry, and she would need that weaponry not only to fight her enemies, but to fight for herself and for her people. A page and a half into the foreword and following her declaration of war, Jordan moves from the battle to protect her body as a Black girl child to the battle to protect her mind and spirit as a young Black woman. She writes, it was the week after the Harlem riot of 1964, a week of lurching around downtown streets like a war zone refugee, that I realized I now was filled with hatred for everything and everyone white. Almost simultaneously, it came to me that this condition, if it lasted, would mean I had lost the point, not to resemble my enemies, not to dwarf my world, not to lose my willingness and ability to love. What came next for Jordan was a very real reckoning, to borrow from the language of the moment, first with herself. Jordan continues, so back in 1964, I resolved not to run on hatred, but instead to use what I loved, words, for the sake of the people I loved. However, beyond my people, I did not know the content of my love. What was I for? This led her to a partnership with R. Buckminster Fuller, to whom she proposed, quote, a collaborative architectural redesign of Harlem as my initial deliberated movement away from the hateful, the divisive, end quote. Jordan's reckoning with herself leads to dreaming and to the necessity of connection. She writes, my sometime optimism born of necessity hardened into a faithful confidence carried by dreams, detailed explorations of the alternative to whatever stultifies and debases our lives. It is only after dreaming and collaboration that Jordan, quote, felt safe in her love again. The effort put into building a new world through architecture also helped to clarify the purpose of the fight. What was I for? And that question is answered by yet another question Jordan posed to herself and to us. What kind of schools and what kind of streets and what kind of parks and what kind of privacy and what kind of beauty and what kind of music and what kind of options would make love a reasonable, easy response? And so we see in that forward, Jordan moved from Black girlhood to the discovery of her first love, words, to the power of the truth, to transformation. And I see aspects of that journey in the work that each of our panelists is doing today, work that is about being for Black girls, for truth-telling and transformation, for fighting the necessary battles with the spirit of love and care for oneself and one's community, and in the end, with a good dose of righteous rage. So with that, let me now turn to introducing our participants in today's conversation, Kat Brooks, Kenley Brown, and Holly Joshi. And after introducing our panelists, I'll move into an opening question for each of them to respond to. My hope is that this will be a conversation, so my panelists are free to riff off of one another, to respond to one another, to push one another. And certainly by the end of the conversation, we'll have some time for folks to engage with Q&A with the audience, so please do post your questions in the Q&A. So our panel today, first, Kat Brooks is an artivist, community leader, mother, and passionate public speaker. She is the co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project, whose mission is to eradicate state violence in communities of color, and executive director of the Justice Teams Network, a statewide coalition of organizations working to end state violence. Kenley Brown, alum of our program, is a postdoctoral fellow at Washington University in St. Louis in the Department of African American Studies. She earned her PhD in African Diaspora African American Studies at UC Berkeley, and she currently runs the Black Girlhood Studies Lab at Wash U. Holly Joshi is a nationally recognized leader in the anti-trafficking and gender-based violence movement. She currently works as the director of racial justice and systems change with Bright Research Group. She previously served as the executive director at Missy and led the child exploitation unit at the Oakland Police Department. outstanding panel. Welcome to each of you. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to start with this question about the truth of a Black girl child. And so each of us tells stories about Black women and girls using similar and different modes of expression: writing, film, poetry, playwriting, data collection and representation. So what do we learn from the truth of a Black girl child, or from the stories of Black women more generally? And what have you learned from your experiences and projects? And so Kat, I'm thinking of your artivism around police violence, including your poetry and your monologue on the police murder of Natasha McKenna. Holly, I'm thinking about your journey from officer to advocate to researcher. And some of that was documented in the film Still I Rise, which focuses on the commercial sexual exploitation of Black girls in Oakland and the Bay Area. And Kenley, I'm thinking about your journey of ethnographic discovery alongside Black girls in a continuation school and what you learned from that experience. And certainly feel free to use specific examples, and to the extent that you've made these connections in your own work, you can also reflect on how some of what I discussed about June Jordan's work shows up in your work as well. And so Kat, we will start with you.
Thank you, Professor Nikki. Thank you for all of you being here. I'm so excited about this conversation. As I was thinking about this question, as often when we're pondering the lives of Black girl children, right? It's deep sadness, because what I really came to, and what I realized that I fought so hard for my own child, is that we actually we've got Black girl children that are never treated like Black girl children. So you can actually look at the things that are being done and the way in which Black girl children are treated and understand that it is a training ground for your life as a Black woman in this country, right? And so Black girl children very early understand what it is to be sexualized, right? It's why, and I'm sure Sister Holly will get in this, it's why 12-year-olds can be bought and sold, 12-year-old Black girls can be bought and sold in broad daylight, right, in the city of Oakland, right? Because they're not seen as children, right? We learn that the vestiges of chattel slavery, right, and the sexualization and utilization and experimentation of our bodies, right, is alive and well in this country. We can see very clearly what miseducation is going to mean for our lives in the experience of Black girl children. What being silenced is, right? Because it starts with our Black girl children. Nikki and you and I spent a lot of time talking about the murder of Ma'Khia Bryant, right? I can't remember in which set of conversation, but what sat with me, right? And for folks who don't know, Ma'Khia Bryant was a 16-year-old child that was murdered by the police in Ohio the very same day that the Derek Chauvin verdict came down. And what struck not just me and not just Professor Jones, probably everybody on this panel and so many more that are listening, was that they were immediately referring to her as a woman, right? That her childhood was erased to justify putting bullets in her center mass for having what was very much a childhood reaction to an intense situation that a child should never have been in, right? The other thing you learn from Black girl children, though, is that we're magic. The other thing that we learn from Black girl children is how to imagine and dream and see in some of the most amazing poets and playwrights and artists, right? When they're allowed to truly be our Black girl children. So it's also through listening to my daughter and her peers talk about the world that, the world that they want to live in and the world that they're willing to fight for, right? The beauty of Black girl magic begins with our Black girl children. I'm gonna stop there before I start blubbering all over.
Thank you for that, Kat. Thank you for opening the conversation in that way. Kenley, we will go to you next.
Yes, thank you so much, Kat, for those words, and both the sorrow, but also the joy and love that Black girls always express in who they are. And Black girls' stories and Black girl child life is what brought me into this ethnographic project. 10, 11 years ago now, Dr. Jones asked me, what can you commit to write for the next 10 years? I didn't think of a place. I didn't think about a geographical area. I thought about Black girls, my commitment to them for life. And so through an ethnographic project where I had the honor and the privilege to sit with Black girls, to explore their dreams, right, their joys, but also their perils, and their experiences with violence and exclusion, and to sit with that care and to figure out how do Black girls unearth their journeys as they're living them out currently. And as Kat mentioned, Black girl children can't be Black girls. And so a lot of Black girls who I spoke to, their intention of joining this work wasn't necessarily to share their story just to share it, but with intention to share their story because they wanted other Black girls like them to read it. As I know we're all familiar with the different stereotypes and representations we see of Black girls in the news and social media, is either the Black girls being punitively and violently treated by institutions of violence like policing and in our schools, but also on the other side, being mythical creatures who somehow rise above the systemic debris of violence and exclusion. The girls I spoke with were the in-between. They're not necessarily in the news, they're not necessarily in social media, and yet their stories bring together and collate how that violence and exclusion comes in together with their intention and care to seek and center love. And so when Dr. Jones talked about the words of June Jordan talking about what is love in the context of that love for her, that is the journey so many girls went on and through in the work. And I'm particularly thinking about 15-year-old Sumari, when she told me in her life story, she's always been in search for love. At 15 years old, she had to figure out where to live because the relationship between her and her mother was so volatile. Volatile really because of the systemic legacy of oppression their community faced, and then it bleeding onto and between a mother and daughter. And through that, it created so much precarity in her life and so much more struggle than a child should have to deal with, that included finding a place to live, food, security, and stability. But in all of that, this Black girl showed up in her life and found love in her community, with her teachers, in her school, and in herself. And so I'm really excited to be in this conversation. I'm grateful to be here, a conversation with brilliant people doing amazing work with Black girls. And I look forward to more of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenley. And I do want our panelists to think about, how they're thinking about what each of us is sharing. And already we're seeing these kind of common themes of Black girlhood. And I love what you said, Kenley, about that in-between, right? That in-between. And so, and I know in the work that we do, we live in an in-between. And so certainly I'm lifting that up and spending some time there as well. Holly.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am not sure how to follow all of that Black girl magic, but what I will say is that, most of my work with and for Black girls has been within the context of carceral systems treatment and responses to Black women and girls. But of course, the carceral system interacts with and is influenced by and influences all other aspects of American society. So when we're talking about punitive responses, they don't just live within CJ systems, they're foundational to our country, right? And particularly our country's interactions with Black people. And it shows up in communities where barbecuing, selling water bottles, dancing, walking, talking, breathing while Black have all elicited resident harassment and phone calls to the police. It shows up in our education systems with disparate push out and punishment. It shows up in child welfare and on and on and on. So knowing that my foundation and experiences working with Black girls in my work has come from carceral systems, I understand the connections between all of our American systems. But my work with Black girls has reinforced what I've always known, right? Growing up as a Black girl surrounded by Black women and girls, and that is that Black girl magic is real. Each of us have talked about that. And what the potion is brilliance, resilience, community, and ancestral wisdom and blessings. And resilient, brilliant experts in their lives are how I define Black girls. They can come up with adaptations to systemic oppressions, and they are deserving of our collective protection and care. And so this collective failure to protect and recognize a sanctity and show up for Black girlhood is ours to own. And Black girls invite us into their oppositional world. And I think that that's what June Jordan is really saying when she says the need to fight, the need to create a different self-awareness, the need to create self-love as radical resistance, and the narrative and truth-telling as transformation. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to ask you, Holly, to expand on that a bit, because I love what you said about it, the invitation into their oppositional world and the dreaming that happens in that space. And what you've seen of that in your own experience, especially in these different domains that you've traveled through. So from working in OPD to moving into advocacy, and now as a researcher, what are the common themes around transformation, right? So June Jordan lays that out so beautifully in this kind of abolitionist vision of what the world would be, a world that would actually be protective of Black girls. And I'm curious what you see as those kind of common strands across those domains, that helps us to think about transformation in a real kind of deep structural level.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've seen is what we're kind of all hitting on, and what the Georgetown, Center on Poverty and Inequality wrote about a few years ago. What you've picked up on in your work, Professor Jones, is really the adultification of Black girls as a foundational issue across all systems. The report discusses the erasure of Black girlhood. They gathered data showing how US adults view Black girls, and they perceive Black girls as early as 5 to be less innocent, more adult-like than their white peers. They think of Black girls as needing less nurturing, less protection, less supports, less comfort. And they believe that Black girls are more independent and know more about adult topics, and specifically, to Kat's point, more about sex than their white peers. And so the implications are significant across all of my work, across criminal justice systems, across research. And I've seen it play out in the real world scenarios and system interactions and responses to Black girls consistently over the years of doing the work. With law enforcement, for example, all the places where law enforcement discretion is allowed, we see discrepancies in decisions about who is deserving of protection, who is being cooperative or not, who law enforcement sees as being cooperative. And then that dictates the system's response. And those responses are racialized. I can give an example of, missing persons cases. When I was at the police department, the way the missing person cases were handled, missing Black teenagers, specifically girls, often received far less investigative efforts than other missing person cases. The system struggled to see their vulnerability, and that manifested in the level of effort, the number of hours willing to be put into locating them, and then the care with which they and their families were treated once they were located. For folks from the Bay Area and specifically folks from Oakland, we all know about the sideshow, illegal sideshow car shows and street racing has been a part of Oakland since my youth. When I was at the police department, I was tasked with working one of them as a new police officer. And so we were assigned to work these sideshows, and there were disparities in enforcement action. One particular evening, I saw a white police officer pull over a car full of white girls participating in the sideshow, young white girls between 16 and 19 years old in this car. He gave them a warning about the dangers of sideshow, the dangers of Oakland, the dangers of being out here. And then he proceeded to practice community care, which is escorting them to be sure that they got on the freeway 580 to make it home. An hour later, I responded to cover the same officer who had stopped a car full of Black girls, the same age, and he was in the process of towing their vehicle and getting ready to leave them on the side of the street. And so I had to intervene at that moment because he could not see their humanity, their vulnerability in the middle of the night, a grown adult police officer getting ready to leave young Black girls on the side of the road, right? And so we see examples of this in all systems. We see systems in their racialized responses to Black girls and the failure to recognize vulnerability and victimization. And again, really what's happening is we're denying Black girls' humanity, right? It's a failure to protect childhood. And then we end up pathologizing their adaptive behaviors and punishing them for surviving, right? And I think that Kat and Kenley probably have a lot to say and to add about that, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I think, Kenley, that flows really well into your work. If you want to respond to that piece of it, that punishment that constrains dreaming but doesn't stop it, right, when it comes to dreaming of and working toward transformation.
Yes, absolutely. I'm thinking about the school setting that the Black girls who I came to know were enrolled into. So continuation education in the state of California is oftentimes advertised as an opportunity for students who are falling off track from graduating, who are at risk of failing their courses once again another semester. And so they're supposed to go to this school that provides a smaller community of learning for them to pick up on credits and to graduate successfully. The reality is, a disproportionate number of students are Black and Brown from communities that have been systemically divested from the state in terms of support and resources. And so in this school, these schools are labeled as dumping grounds, and not only the academic literature, but also among parents, teachers, and students themselves. A number of students reported in the classroom when I would be sitting there during Spanish class or geography saying, this school is where the bad kids go. So I'm a bad kid, so where am I going to go in my future? And so the kids already who are put on the periphery of society, who already think they're less than because of their treatment in mainstream schooling, are then transferred to a school that furthers this deprecation. And so with that language and logics, that school ultimately does not provide a curriculum that's advantageous in terms of being able for them having the ability to apply to college, enroll in college, because their credits are not legible for college applications. In terms of career mobility, there's not any electives to learn about different curriculums that they could be interested in, like in business, in music, and writing. It's a reduced curriculum. And so ultimately, students are then warehoused in this dumping ground for X amount of years until they graduate. And so what I witnessed and saw in that school was a paradox, and was very interesting, because as a school, it was on the margins and was exclusionary with limited resources. And yet the Black teachers and administrators there were intended to be change makers in the lives of these youth. They wanted to galvanize resources the best they could. They want to offer opportunities that were otherwise offered in the school setting. And even through all of the resources they provided, that included funding for like dental care for students, that included additional classes like hip hop studies and feminist studies, and even included a garden and a kitchen for students to learn how to eat healthily. At the end of my time of doing this ethnography at the school for 2 years, at the end of that 2 years, all those teachers and administrators left because the school had a significant budget cut that truncated their resources by half, that was already limited. And so for me, looking at this ethnography, to study a place demonized as a dumping ground for students who already are oftentimes displaced and vulnerable, it showed me that even work within that, it can sustain dreaming, but that dreaming is precarious. And so my thinking is, instead of thinking about how we can make better teachers or better students, how can we create better institutions, better institutional goals and visions? That's where transformation stands and lies, in access and understanding of humanizing the system. The people are just fine. And what I did find was that the joy and love in that school was very much palpable. And however, the systemic terrors and logics is what undermined them ultimately. And so now I'm in step with learning more about how can we galvanize an institutional transformation versus solely at the individual level, because again, like Holly said, these systems are dehumanizing. How can you hold on to your worth and dignity as a human being that includes protection, stability, and love ultimately in a system that degrades your humanity?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kenley. That I want to bring you into this conversation, Kat, because I think the point of institutional transformation, I go back to the video clip that you shared and that we will share in the chat of your monologue on Natasha McKenna. And this was in 2017, I believe that the clip is from, and the murder was in 2015. So that's before this moment, and yet the seeds of this moment are there. So what people are calling for how people are responding to your performance, and maybe give folks some background who aren't familiar with the monologue as well. But the kinds of institutional transformations that they are talking about are the kinds of transformations that have taken front stage in the current conversation around police reform and police abolition. And I'm also really curious to hear you talk about why art is a mode of activism for you, and what you see there that you can access that can't be accessed in other kinds of modes of protest.
Some big questions. I'm going to try to remember them and tackle them. But there's a couple things that I want to say first. And this, I guess, goes to the art piece, right? And 2 years ago, yeah, I became the program director for Three Girls Theater Investigates. And what our program does is we utilize investigative techniques, right? We empower artists with the resources to utilize investigative techniques to identify, research, and investigate, and then tell stories about issues in their community. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to talk about because, right, everybody expects me to talk about state terror, right? This Gab Brooks, she's going to talk about the police and the prisons and the violence of the carceral state. And actually, that issue intersects with every other issue, right? Because that is the way that they maintain the system, right? It's through the violence of the carceral state. So let's be really clear about that. But anyway, I was trying to sort of think, are there other stories that I want to tell about Black people? All my storytelling is about Black people, right? In part because it's so important for us to tell our stories in our own voices from our own lived experiences. In part because it's important for us to counter the stories that are told about us, right, through mainstream media propagandas like, Hollywood. And I was an artist before I was an activist. I took the stage as 8 years old. It saved my life. I would not be sitting here. Granted, I still had many bumps in the road, but then bumps would have turned into ditches, right, real fast if I hadn't had the arts. So anyway, I'm thinking about what story it is I want to tell, and I do radio. So I also, unfortunately, spend a lot of time scrolling the news. And this headline hit that there were 64,000 missing Black women and girls in America. Sit with that for a minute. 64,000 missing Black girls and women in America. If those white girls, right, people would be in the streets setting stuff on fire. But when we go in the streets and set stuff on fire, we're criminalized for a righteous rage response. And so that led me on this journey, right? And so the piece is called Surviving Oakland, and looking at missing, trafficked, and murdered Black women and girls, right? And really doing the whole circle that, like, some of this violence may come, and often does come, at the hands of people that we know, right? That are called family. But the perpetuation of the violence, the fact that we are not looking for those 64,000 girls. I already brought up the babies, right? That are being bought and sold. And that also takes me to, right, the untold stories and the names that we do not know, that so many of us do not know, the Black women and girls that are murdered every year by the police, right? And the other thing that I want to bring up is that actually the primary way that Black women and girls experience state-sponsored terror is through sexual assault, right? So people may remember the Celeste Guap rape scandal. It is not a sex scandal, it's a rape scandal. She was a child. One of the conversations that we were having, right, is that her story is the story of so many Black girls, She just, her story got the traction. I think that art allows us to have conversations that people would not otherwise be willing to have. There are folks that can't stand to tune in to hear me on KPFA, right? There are folks that would never go out and risk tear gas, as we congregate in Oscar Grant Plaza, but they will go into a 99-seat Black box theater, right? And hear stories. And what's great about that is that, you can't get up and leave in the middle of a play, right? You're stuck, at least until intermission, to have to hear that story. And that's the power of art. It allows us to access the hearts and minds and souls of folks in ways that maybe other modalities do not. And I wanted to say one last thing, and that's about the dreaming part, right? The way that Black girls dream and the power of their creation, which is something I heard both Holly and Kenley touch on. The way that I met Holly actually is that we were running a program at Missy doing arts activism with at-risk Black girls. And when I tell you, we went from absolute refusal to participate, forget you, anything you're talking about, to one of the most beautiful productions at Eastside Arts Alliance that I have ever had the honor of being a part of. Their voices, their words, their blocking, right? And it was all about their dreaming, right? Dreaming for a better world, a better place, what life could be like past this moment, right? Where they were so often looked at as a statistic or a number or a sad case, or man, the power of Black girls' dreams, right? And I think one of the places that we see that expressed the best is through theater telling, is through music, right? Some of the dopest MCs on the planet, right, are Black girls. Through Black paintings, Black short stories. It's a place of creation, and I think in part because our voices are silenced from such a young age, right? From Granny on up, right? I mean, I still come from the place, we were to be seen and not heard, right? And understanding where that came from, because that was actually survival for our grannies, right? Is to be seen and not heard. So the arts give us a voice. They are the artists are supposed to be the conscience of our communities. They're supposed to force us to reckon with ourselves. And I think it's really important to point out right now where there's this tagline to reimagine. Who helps you see things that you've never seen before? Artists.
Yes, that reminds me of something that Professor Rayford said about art recently, that art helps us to manifest what we can only dream. That might not be an exact quote, but maybe we can drop that video from where that quote comes from in the chat. But exactly. And so, Kenley, I want to bring you in here as someone who was trained first as a social scientist and then moved into an interdisciplinary space, was doing this ethnographic work at a continuation school, and came across poetry, right? Came across the poetry of Black girls, and what you saw in their poetry that was reflective of both their experiences and the harm and the trauma, as well as their dreaming and their imagining of what another world would look like.
Yes, absolutely. Dreaming became a central theme between Black girls and myself, particularly through art. So, Kat, I absolutely agree and witness the power of art and how it allowed Black girls to survive the violence that they could not voice and communicate because they were silenced, because they had to protect someone else. And so I'm thinking of this young woman named Paradise. I met her when she was 16 years old. And I think it was about a month in when I had first come to the school. And one of the things I do as an ethnographer is I don't do one-on-one interviews. I allow time to build rapport and trust and time, and just to learn more about them in their school and their lives, and then to learn more about myself. And so we're in her Spanish class, and she pulls up on her computer a poem she wrote called My Society. And in this poem, she captures the intergenerational chains, but also potential of her family. So in this poem, she's speaking about the systemic violence that her two brothers were oppressed under and were eventually incarcerated, and the pain that their mother felt. And it felt like what she names as the 13 bullets that went through her mother's heart, seeing her sons being taken by the state in that way. And that attachment from the 13 stars is an analogy to the 13 colonies of this country that is premised upon a colonial imagination, a colonial dream. And so you have this 16-year-old interrogating these questions in about 25 stanzas. And in this, in her poetry, she not only highlights that those legacies of violence under the state, but also the hopes and dreams she has for her community, including that she is unlocking the key to success for those she loves, including her brothers, including her friends and her schoolmates. And it's through her poetry, she's able to show the both and. And I think what I loved about getting to know her and so many other of the young women now and to this day is showing how it's like when you can be under these oppressive systems, there are these moments and events of light and joy and love. And at the end of the day, Black girls are telling a story of love. And people don't like to name love stories attached to Black girls because oftentimes the love stories have the Black women or Black girls devastated. But in their stories, that's not the case. And in fact, they're the central characters, both to the light, but also to an awareness of what's going on around them and those who they love. In addition, she also wrote urban fiction and short stories around what she witnessed that her mother go through and her great grandmother go through. And I remember poignantly, we're at dinner and she just told me, she's like, I can't tell the difference between the pain in my bones are mine or my mother's. And I think that kind of language from a young person who is not given a lot of space to voice out how they're feeling in the world and just so beautifully articulated what we are always in search of. And so with her work and with the creative work, I had to think about who are Black girls at the heart of the question when we're looking at discipline and punishment in schools, when I'm looking at this through ethnography, right? A system of methodologies that came from colonial imaginations to continue to repress groups of people that were outside of the white imagination. And how do you subvert that? And so with these Black girls, I learned how to hold mutual vulnerability, compassion, and witnessing in that time through an imaginative space and dreaming alongside them and having, again, the honor to document this and to share out their stories in the eventual book. And Paradise's work has been circulated and published. And so I'm very proud of her. And she's also been into my course and to give talks about her positionality. And it's been amazing just to see her grow. But I also want to support systems that allow her to do that community care work. As Holly mentioned, how do you professionalize your lived experience? And how do you get paid to do that work? And I want to be on that side of history where you're employing people from the community to do that community work, to share in that mentorship and that care.
Thank you. Holly, I think you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I just love this conversation about the importance of narrative change work. I mean, I think it's critical. It's absolutely critical. So what I wanted to add was, the African proverb is, until the lion has her own historian, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And in June Jordan's work, we saw her fighting for Black English to be recognized as an actual dialect, right? She was saying to her students, be proud that this is a strength, this is a skill, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. We know that who controls the narrative controls the definition of the problem, the proposed solutions, and the resources, right? And so being in this work for so long, I developed a deep appreciation for storytelling as critical to social change efforts and narrative work as transformative. That the narrative work is political work because politics is largely a fight over ideology and who gets to influence the way we think about and understand what's happening, right? The who, the why, and what the solutions are. And I've done plenty of policy work, and policy work is important. I've worked on anti-trafficking policy issues, including SB 1322 and California Prop 35. And those laws basically mandated that law enforcement and child welfare systems recognize that children under 18 cannot be held legally responsible for their own sexual victimization. But what I learned really hard policy lessons, and that is that culture eats policy for breakfast and finds a way around policy if we're not actually doing deep cultural narrative change work, right? Like, these systems are microcosms of larger society and most often reflect the stories and beliefs that we tell ourselves about Black girls. And the other critical piece of narrative change work that I think Kat was touching on in telling the story about how we met at Missy is that consciousness raising work relates to our internalized narrative, right? The internalized oppression that June Jordan understood, that Du Bois talks about, that James Baldwin said was the most insidious form of racism, is believing what they say about you. And so doing internal narrative change work and creating intentional safe spaces for Black girls to dream and create their own narratives, that is hugely important. In all of my work with trafficked girls and survivors of sex trafficking, it's the exploiter's narrative, it's the system's narrative, it's everyone else's narrative about who they are and why they are in their situation. And most oftentimes we're telling Black girls that the reason they're in difficult situations is because of their personal choices or because of the choices of their families, right? And so bringing it back to a systemic analysis, and there's healing power in that political education and critical consciousness and awareness raising for Black girls. Because when we take it from the micro to the macro, we now see our circumstances differently, right? So in relation to working with Black girls and with survivors, when we provide space and support to begin to interrogate what we've heard about our bad choices and our bad families as the reason for our suffering, then we begin to see that it's a setup, right? That we weren't meant to thrive. And so finding self-love for Black girls is critical resistance, and that awareness is healing. And sometimes that awareness turns into activism, and activism and political movement for people of color is also healing, right? So I just really wanted to uplift what both Kenley and Kat were raising around the importance of art, the importance of narrative and narrative change as political activity.
So, I mean, I think the first thing that I want to uplift, and I know it's stuff that we already know, but every institution, every structure, every system in this country is born out of race-based capitalism, is born out of chattel slavery. It's actually what makes capitalism in this country, unique to this country. And it's not cliche, it's the truth, right? Like the what it looks like has changed. Who it looks like has shifted some, right? But its intention, it was never for us to thrive. It was for us to be living in exactly the conditions that we're living in. And so I would just want to say a little bit about policy, right? And about the culture eating policy for breakfast. So when we started at Anti-Police Terror Project, we didn't engage in policy. Actually, we refused to engage in policy because we believed that policy was about reform, and reform means to fix things. And there was nothing about this thing that could be fixed. It actually needed to be burnt completely to the ground, right? And then start all over again. And folks take that how they want to take it. We started to engage in a particular kind of policy, and we defined the types that we would, and we call it radical reform. Right. So we don't engage in policy that tinkers around the edges of stuff. We don't deal with policy that attempts to fix the status quo, that validates the status quo. So for us, let's just take like state terror, right? We don't support body cameras. We don't support cultural competency training. Like, no, we spent millions and millions of dollars doing that. It has not worked. So we don't do that. We only engage in policy. And this is the harder game to play and it is a game, right? It's a game, whether you're talking about local, state, or federal, it's a game. It makes it harder to play the game, but we only enact policy that's going to move the needle. Even if it's just this much, it's going to move the needle. But we engage in it because we recognize that the genocide that our people are facing is so great, right, that it has to be all roads in. So I just wanted to chime in that piece around policy. It's never. What's that saying? You cannot use the master's tools, right, to build our new house. It just can't happen. And if that's what we're doing, right, we are failing because we are all infected with white supremacy, which means we're all capable, right, of engaging those practices, and that's not what we're trying to replicate. So I want to say that, and then the other two things I want to say was about payment, and I think it's really important to know that we provide, or Missy provided stipends, right, for the girls to attend. And for people that are working with Black girls and women, stop asking us to give you our trauma and our pain and our memories for free, for your papers and your books and your articles, right? Compensate us, empower us, right, to transform some conditions in our space. And then also the importance of agency, right? The stories that Black girls want to tell may not be about being on E14. It may not be about their uncle raping them. It may not be about, being food insecure. They might want to tell a story, right, about climbing a rainbow and talking to God, right? And if that's the story that's in the Black girl's heart, then give her the agency to tell that story and stop asking to capitalize off of our trauma and pain and not have that be a part of the healing of our trauma and pain.
Yes, I don't know if either one of the panelists, Holly or Kenley, you want to speak to that?
Yes, absolutely, particularly around compensation and payment. I think to do this research, to do this work within the space of the academy where that's not a requirement, creates harm at the end of the day. And so even knowing what you're compensating with is not nearly enough. And so for me, as someone who is in the university setting, who did conduct an ethnography, there were some things I did have to check at the door and unlearn over time. And the work of Joyce Ladner and Tomorrow's Tomorrow, where she went back to her community, worked with Black girls and women. She talked about how she had to unlearn some of the logics that she was taught in graduate school when getting involved in learning the stories of these Black girls and women. And at the end of the day, that then requires a particular accountability of the individual. And so I'm also brought back to Toni Morrison's work, her preface in The Bluest Eye, and talking about her work after she won the Nobel Prize for literature. And she was saying in her work, she wanted people to be moved, instead they were touched. They read Pacola's story, the main character of The Bluest Eye, and pitied her rather than interrogating their own ways in which they're complicit in her demise. And so for me, I took to understand how ethnography is a contribution of that demise of Black girls, and how do we transform that? How do we interrogate that? How do we ask the uncomfortable questions? And today I continue to ask that, and I'm asked that in community and other people, and I've learned from others, particularly from this department, of thinking about that intentionality of work, because it can be harmful. Research can be very dangerous, and we do need to honor and center Black girls' stories and lives. And it just doesn't have to be off their pain and trauma. They can talk about what they want to, how they want to. And I think with the work that I've learned over time with them is saying that, okay, this is the story that they want to tell, and also honoring that when they come back and ask you to redact something, redact it. Come back to them, show them their story. So many young girls I work with, I showed them the chapter and they read it and they paused and literally couldn't believe this is their life. So part of me was thinking, wow, Black girls are living their histories simultaneously, and they're living them so quickly that they don't even know this is culminating all at once. And so I'm always thinking about how can we create more care, more time, and more intention in our methods and methodologies to center people, not just study people. So thank you for that comment, Kat. And I'm hoping we can continue to do that type of interrogative work within the academy and our accountability in these systems of harm.
Yes, I appreciate that. It reminds me of a conversation we had last year in the spring series. Marian Kaba and Connie One helped us to center how much harm the academy does, and to the extent that some of us are in the academy, and then what does it mean to be doing this work from that space, or any other institutional space that has leverage and power over the lives of Black girls, right? So I appreciate you both bringing us back to that conversation. We do have a couple of comments, a question and a comment in the Q&A. So I want to ask audience members to take a moment and to add to that as well. And I have one more question, and then I'll come to a Q&A question. One of the things that strikes me about Jordan's work, and that resonates with me as a queer Black woman in reading her work, is the queerness of her Black girlhood, right? And so we can talk about Black girlhood as if it's one thing, but we know that's not the case. And when we think about violence, we can think about the violence against trans Black women. We could think about the violence against femmes. We could think about violence against gender nonconforming, Black youth. And certainly, I wish Jordan was around today to have access to whatever language she would have created for herself or for others to borrow on, to think about the queerness of her own childhood and her life. And so I'm wondering if you have reflections on that, like how do we, in this kind of expansive storytelling, how do we also expand out what we think constitutes Black girlhood, so that we're not reinforcing these kind of normative understandings of gender or sexuality in our own activism and advocacy and protest. And I open that up to the panel.
Yeah, I think for when you're talking, I was thinking in terms of what stories and whose stories we're telling. And when I, as a theater maker, create grants, right? And I'm writing and I'm asking to tell stories, that I'm really clear, right? That I'm talking about Black women and girls, Black identified women and girls, that is inclusive when we're talking about the politics. I mean, I think one of the most powerful things that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Or whose stories we were telling, and particularly the levels of violence that Black trans women experience at the hands of law enforcement. And that was an expansion of mind and language and movement, I think, in ways that are so powerful in terms of the possibility for transformation. And I think so the insistence, right, on that, and the relearning, reteaching yourself, if that's what you need to do, if you say that you're going to be a soldier, right, in this justice struggle. Yeah, intentionality. And I'm sorry, and also, and taking leadership from, right? So it was also, I think, really dangerous when we started talking about Black trans women. I'm not a Black trans woman, right? And so if I'm on a stage and I'm talking about the stories of Black trans women, and I'm looking at the row of speakers behind me and none of them are Black trans women, right? Something has gone horribly wrong. And so self-checking ourselves in the movement around that, I think, has been really, really important. And it has not always been successful. It has raised some of our own ugliness on the left, which again, if you're going to be a warrior or soldier, right, in this fight, standing in that gap and looking at yourself in the mirror is what we tell white people to do. If you're not working on your own white supremacist stuff every single day, then you ain't no ally of mine. And I think we got to apply the same standards to ourselves.
Indeed. So Holly, did you want to add to that as well?
I was just going to echo what Kat said. I think for me, definitely when I was running Missy, for folks who don't know, Missy is the only organization in Oakland that exists to specifically serve girls who've been sex trafficked with direct services. And I remember asking myself, can we be and are we currently a safe space for Black trans girls? Because we know that they are the most marginalized and most impacted by sex trafficking and sexual violence. And I didn't have an answer to that. And so sitting with that humility and going to the Black trans girls that were coming to Missy and asking them, are we a safe space? And in which ways are we not? And them being very open and saying, well, you all give me a bag each week when I come in here that's full of, some great things, toiletries and all of that. I don't need maxi pads and I don't want tampons, like just basic things that our cisgendered privilege would not allow us to see, that did not feel like safe space or space for the Black trans girls that were there. And so I say all of that to just say, what Kat is saying is what I try to practice every day, which is if I'm demanding and requiring and using my position and seats at tables to demand that other people look at their privileges, how am I doing that every day? How am I recognizing that, yes, I'm a Black woman and I'm light-skinned and I'm cisgendered and I have educational privilege and I have all of these things and I need to be humble and I need to ask questions, and then believe and trust the people that I'm asking the questions to. I think that one of the things I learned as a service provider was that there's this constant narrative about how important it is to build trust. We need to build our clients' trust. They need to trust us, because if we have trusting relationships with people, then they come and then they open up and then we're able to support what they need. The thing I don't think we talk about enough is like, we need to trust them. Right? Like I need to be able to trust her. Like I don't just need her to trust me. That's what like a real relationship is. It's mutual trust. And so in order for us to not be saviors, in order for us to not take power away, then it has to be a mutual relationship, just like all of the rest of our relationships. And then the only other thing I'll add is just another lesson that I've been practicing implementing is around this danger of a single narrative. During the pandemic, we heard a lot about, how much Black folks are suffering more than others and how Black children are suffering more than others and all of that. And that was very true in many ways. And there's a complexity. We had the chance to do focus groups with a lot of Black kids across the state. And, some of them said that I'm actually feeling like I'm doing better going to school from home because I don't have to get up every day and navigate white spaces. You know, I feel supported at home. I don't have to be constantly bombarded by micro and macro aggressions that come with navigating school systems. And so I say that to say we have to be careful of not going with what the system narrative is all the time about Black people and Black girls and Black families, because it can very quickly go from folks need additional supports because they've been historically and ongoing marginalized to they're problematic and we're pathologizing again, right? And so I think it's, again, wrestling with the complexities and recognizing that Black girls are full humans. So just like all of us, they experience families and communities as sources of pain, but also as sources of strength in a lot of ways.
Thank you. So I'm gonna, Kenley, unless you want to add to that, I was gonna shift to the Q&A.
Oh, you can shift. Love all of this. Yes. Stay accountable. I'm constantly learning and unlearning. And when I came into the field at that school, I made sure to talk about what I mean by Black girl and in heart, body, mind, and spirit, and that openness and that understanding and having the tough conversations and being open to not only listening, but following up that listening with real action in our language and how we show up. And so it's something that I'm also committing to daily in my work, but also in my communities as well. And so it's always learning, and that's just humanity. We can't pick one. And so I think about all the conversation we have around say her name, say his name. That's ineffectual, is say our names, because we all are tied and tethered together. And so I think that's what's being unearthed now in these conversations that are really important, and actions, right?
Yeah, that flows really well into one of our questions. So I'm gonna share this question. First, I want to share one of the comments. It says, no questions here, just a deep, deep appreciation for this panel and the opportunity to listen to the wisdom and centering of Black girls' humanity and brilliance. And so I thank all of you as well for what we've shared so far. And so to the point that you just brought up, Kenley, around, say her name, say his name, I'm going to bring in this question. When I was a young person, boys were constantly taken away from the community via bullets or incarceration. How does this factor into each of the panelists' work with Black girls today who still undergo this loss, and some would say have PhDs in loss? Who wants it? Yes, Kat.
I mean, I guess where I go first is, but boys are still being taken away from our community via bullets or incarceration every single day, right? Police in this country that we know of kill over 1,000 folks a day. The vast majority of those are Black, and the vast majority of those are Black men. What we're not talking about is the mothers and the partners and the daughters that are left behind. When I was 8, my father went to prison for substance abuse. Now, he didn't die, but it was an effective death for me because I didn't see him, right, for 6 years. And when I talk a lot about trauma, because it's so critical, right? We're talking about healing, we've got to talk about trauma, like the trauma that inflicted on my life, and the choices, some of the very bad choices that I would go on to meet because of that interruption of that father-daughter bond. Flash forward to much of my work is with families that have lost loved ones to state violence. And some of the most resilient, amazing, powerful, passionate human beings that I know. And I've also seen these Black women, in particular, I'm thinking about, some of the older Black women that have been carrying the burden of white supremacy on their shoulder for so long. Right, to then have this added on top of them, and you see their knees buckle, but they never hit the ground. I'll just tell really quickly the story of Ada Perkins. Her son Richard Perkins was murdered in East Oakland in 2015, and Ada is church-going, bubbly, lively, smart, funny. I mean, just being around her, you're infected by her joy. This is post, right? Her son's murder. Richard was murdered catty corner from the block that they lived on. And Miss Ada was walking home and she saw the body bag and she stopped and prayed for the mother of whoever child that was, without realizing that she was praying for herself. And then the other thing that I would say, right, is important and it's not just as those of us that are losing our babas and our uncles and our brothers and our sons, our children, to the violence of the carceral state. And I say all violence is the violence of the carceral state because the state creates the conditions that foster all of the violence, right? Is that when we talked about earlier, Black women and girls are also the victims of state-sponsored terror, right? Hundreds and hundreds of unknown names. And I'm so grateful for the Say Her Name movement that finally thrust right it into the spotlight. And still we have to fight to be able to talk about those things. And so I just really quickly, because I didn't get a chance to do it, Natasha McKenna, it's actually a full-length play now, right? She was tased to death in 2015 in the Fairfax County Jail in the middle of a schizophrenic episode. The last words, one of the last sets of words she said was, "You promised you wouldn't kill me," right? And she had experienced the terror of the state from the onset of her schizophrenia, which they couldn't find the right meds for her. She was bounced from institution to institution. The police knew who she was. She'd been sexually assaulted. I mean, you name it, every horrific thing that could have happened to her. And then her mother's trying to hold her through all of that violence, only to lose her to the violence of the state, is Natasha's story, but it's also the story of so many Black women and girls across this country. And it's playing out every single day.
Thank you, Kat. Kenley or Holly, do you want to add to that? I want to take a moment just to hold that. I think that, something Kenley said about, Black girls living life so quickly, and many of us doing this work sometimes, we can move through these stories quickly, but I think it calls to be held. And so I'm just going to hold a minute of space. And what I would invite people to do in the chat is to add a name of someone you love, someone who has survived, someone who's been lost to the violence, to the streets, to those who on the front lines fighting battles for Black communities, and also particularly for Black girls. We're in this conversation. I could think of other folks in this conversation as well, like Joyce Ladner that Kenley mentioned, Connie One, I mentioned as well, Savannah Sean Gay, Nashawn Battle. We could, people who, LaConte Dill, Ruth Nicole Brown. These are some folks that have been, that have inspired the work that I've done around Black girls. But let's just take a moment. And if you just want to think about it in your head, that's fine too. But I just want us to hold that, even just for, another 30 seconds, take a belly breath, as they say, because it's real. Thank you. Thank you for bringing the names of people into the space, because they are with us. We know that they are with us in this virtual space that we are in this moment and always. So I'm going to move on to the next question here. So thank you so much for this conversation. I'm thinking a lot about culture and the ideologies written into the ways people continue to adultify Black girls, even in popular representations. Can the panel talk more explicitly about culture and how we change culture? And we've spoken to this just a little bit, especially beyond the trauma that we experience. And we've talked a bit about institutional culture, but what about, culture writ large, right? And how do we, and it gets a bit back into the narrative change conversation as well. So I wonder if there's anything else you folks would want to add to that. How are we trying to change culture? What I hear is a reflection of Jordan's work as well, is that it starts with us, right? So it's not an out there, right? But the path to structural transformation is very closely tied to who we are and who we are shoulder to shoulder with. And I've heard that in the comments from each of you. it's about where are we positioning ourselves when we have power, right? And when we have access, right? When we have privilege, how is that shared? And how do we get out of the way, right? And how do we hold our own Black girlhoods? And Kenley, you've written about this as well as, grown women, right? And how do we access that? So I'm going to, I have a question here. So this is a thank you for Holly. To Holly, I remember working with you when my daughter was being trafficked and was devastated when she was arrested and put in juvie. I'm one of the many parents that reach out to you looking for alternative responses to the punitive measures that were supposedly in place to keep my daughter safe. Thank you for your transition and for the work you did on SB 1322. Do you want to talk about that policy work a bit, Holly?
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I did that policy work. I did Cal Prop 35, which was, the first California anti-trafficking legislation in the state. But really, both of those policies were built from our lived experience of working in the field with trafficked Black girls and constantly turning corners to try and find resources and protections and finding nothing there. When I first started anti-trafficking work, it was 2004, and we weren't even saying trafficking, right? Girls were being called prostitutes at 12 and 11 years old. And as this mother points out, being taken into juvenile hall because the child welfare system would not accept them. And so, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and there I am in the middle of a hotel room with a 12-year-old girl, and there's nowhere to take her, and there's no specialized resources. And so the policy work that I've been involved in over the past 15 years has come from the work in the field directly with girls and understanding of their needs and the system's failures. So, 1322 was a law to basically mandate and force police officers to stop arresting 12 and 13 and 14-year-old girls in the field for prostitution. Because that's what had been happening, like I said, for decades upon decades. So that particular legislation made it no longer legal for law enforcement to arrest anyone under 18 for prostitution-related offenses. So forcing, right, mandating that officers recognize victimization in the field, and then pivoting the care of trafficked girls from the carceral system to the child welfare system. And we could talk about all the lessons in that all day, but I will say that, again, pivoting from one American system to another did not necessarily create increased safety, right? Because the child welfare system had the same beliefs about the girls as the carceral system did. And so then we're reckoning with that. And that's kind of what we're in the midst of now. I mean, they're not being arrested. They don't have a criminal case. That's good. That's a win. But in terms of their safety and their love and the recognition of them as victims, we still have a lot of work to do. And so that's what I was speaking to when I was speaking about my policy lessons and saying that, policy, to Kat's point, number one, it can't tinker at the fringes. It has to be substantive. And it also has to be coupled with ongoing narrative change work and cultural change work and challenging systems to redefine themselves. I mean, those are kind of the hard system lessons that I've learned over the years with the work.
Thank you. And this last question, I think we're coming up against time, so I think this will probably be a good last question, and to hear from each of you on this. And it speaks to both that battle for change in the way that you were talking about, that each of you were talking about, and also understanding that it's an ongoing struggle to find these safe spaces, to create these safe spaces, and that those don't exist yet, or if they did, we wouldn't be where we are, right? So how do we build those spaces? So Claudine writes, I am so grateful for this panel. Thank you. As we work to create community care networks for Black girls, Can each of you perhaps talk about what care networks could look like for us Black women doing this work? So thinking about the care networks, both for Black girls and for Black women doing the work. What are we dreaming of here?
What comes to mind when I hear about safety and space is really mental health of Black girls and women. I found that the girls who I saw 3 to 4 years later, they talked about a lot of their issues came down to the fact that they were either depressed, they were having manic episodes, and they didn't know it. And so I think part of safety is also being able to be vulnerable in a safe place where you will not be punitively punished, as Kat shared in the young woman who was murdered. And also about the 9-year-old girl in Rochester, New York, she called the police for a mental health crisis, and they ended up pepper spraying her in the face at 9 years old. And so I think a call of to be able to be vulnerable, that our mental and bodily and spiritual health can be met and protected and loved. And so that's how I would envision a sanctuary and just a space and a moment to take a breath.
So I'll segue to that. Back to what I said, right? These systems they're never going to work for us ever, right? And so we're working to figure out how to survive them. APTP was born to be visionary, not just reactionary. We need both. And by visionary, that meant how do we interrupt the harm of white supremacy before it hit our communities instead of being in the perpetual response mode. And so for us, that has meant looking at all of the places that the violence of militarized police and the carceral state are enmeshed in our communities where they don't need to be. And so we've actually started our own community care crisis response models. So APTP, we created Mental Health First. They are the only non-911 response to mental health crisis in both Oakland and Sacramento. And mind you, it's not just Western diagnosed mental health crisis, right? I'm a Black mama and I'm working 6 jobs and I got 4 kids and I still can't pay the damn bills. So I'm standing in the middle of 27th and Market and I'm screaming at the top of my lungs, right? Which actually makes sense, but who does she call? She can call Mental Health First, right? Participant-centered, participant-determined through the lens of Black women creation, because that's who created this response model. We're looking at interpersonal violence, right? So many of it, I'm a survivor. I'm a multi-time survivor of interpersonal violence. What I learned the hard way, what so many Black women and girls learn the hard way, is that your police are not your friends, right? And that often, right, you're either going to go to jail where you're going to be further traumatized and have violence, right? Somebody gets seriously hurt, or somebody's going to end up dead, right? And so creating non-police responses to interpersonal violence, the substance abuse, so many of us, and I'm saying us because I know it's folks that are on this call, so many of us are numbing away the pain of white supremacy and trauma, right? We don't need a badge and a gun response, we need a us response. And so those are some of the things that we're working on. Those are things that we're seeing actually pop up across the country. It's a super exciting time for mutual aid, and most of the mutual aid programs that I'm seeing being designed are being designed and led by Black women and girls. So yay us.
Yes to everything. Yes to all of that. And I would just add that we just listen to what girls say. The Alliance for Girls did a couple of back-to-back really, great reports doing community-based action research with girls. And the girls said that poverty and the need for more resources flowing into the community is their biggest barrier to their dreams. Right. And so universal basic income, obviously is one thing I'm dreaming about and thinking about. The reallocate and reinvestment movement is trying to do what girls are saying they need. Girls are naming. No one named the police as a resource. They did not say that the police helped them feel safe. They said that they need more understanding from the caring adults in their lives. That means more time for the caring adults in their lives. To Kenley's point, more space, more breathing room. They need more support and compassion, more interventions from community members, more teachers of color, more role models, more girl-safe spaces. Like all of these things are in alignment with community reinvestment. And we have a lot of these things. I want to also, recognize the hard work that's being done by a lot of community first responders already. We have drop-in centers, we have community circles, we have restorative justice, we have community coaching, we have prevention curriculum and violence intervention and responses. They need to be scaled and professionalized, because right now the people are doing the work in community They're doing great. They don't have enough funding. They don't have enough money. They're not getting paid. They're getting burnt out. They're struggling with mental health issues, all of those things. So many of the solutions exist, is what I mean to say. And those solutions need to be scaled and professionalized.
Thank you. As I thought that was a great place to end our conversation, I just want to end it by elevating a comment and then a final quote from June Jordan. And so Adrian in the chat says, I can imagine no greater honoring of June Jordan's life and legacy than this conversation. Powerfully brilliant, heartfelt, and galvanizing. Deepest thanks. And I echo those thanks. And to end, this conversation could continue, and it will continue offline amongst each of us. I just want to say that I have so much deep love and respect for each of you. And I'm so grateful for what I've learned from you and from what I'm learning from you. And I'm sure that folks in the audience feel that as well. And so I'm going to end with what I thought would be a good quote. And I think I'm right on this one. So Jordan ends that forward with this. My life seems to be an increasing revelation of the intimate face of universal struggle. You begin with your family and the kids on the block, and next you open your eyes to what you call your people. And that leads you into land reform, into Black English, into Angola, leads you back to your own bed where you lie by yourself, wondering if you deserve to be peaceful or trusted or desired or left to the freedom of your own unfaltering heart. And the scale shrinks to the size of a skull, your own interior cage. And then if you're lucky, and I have been lucky, everything comes back to you. And then you know why one of the freedom fighters in the 60s, a young Black woman interviewed shortly after she was beaten up for riding near the front of an interstate bus, you know why she said, we are all so very happy. It's because it's on. All of us and me by myself, we're on. And so it seems fitting to end today's panel with both that warning and that promise. We are on, and we're in this together. And thank you so much for each of you for being here and for everyone who joined us today for this conversation. Thank you, Kat, Kenley, and Holly. Thank you.